Okay, folks, welcome to topic 2 of Unit 2 in the higher human biology course. Topic 2 is all about the hormonal control of reproduction. Okay, so we're going to talk about puberty and we're going to talk about the impact that those hormones have on the reproductive systems. So, first up, let's talk about puberty. Okay, the hormonal onset of puberty. So, we all know, just through general knowledge as well as our study of biology, that hormones play an important part in puberty in humans. And all of this originates from an organ known as the pituitary gland. Okay, that's the one that secretes the hormones that are responsible for puberty. Okay, and the hormones that the pituitary gland release are called follicle stimulating hormone, or FSH for short, luteinizing hormone, or LH for short, or interstitial cell stimulating hormone, or ICSH for short. Okay, now in the exam, you can use the abbreviated versions. You don't have to say the full names. The advantage of knowing the full names, I always say to my classes, is that the names give you a little bit of a hint as to what they do. Okay. Not all the names, but some of the names give you a hint. So, for example, follicle stimulating hormone stimulates the follicle. Interstitial cell stimulating hormone stimulates the interstitial cells. Okay. So it gives you a bit of a hint as to what it does if you know the full name, but don't worry about writing it down in the exam. Abbreviations are absolutely fine. Okay, so our pituitary gland releases these three hormones at puberty. Okay, now what triggers the pituitary gland to start releasing those at puberty? Well, it's something called a releaser hormone. Okay, and that is released and produced by the hypothalamus. Now, if we look at the diagram of the brain here, okay, we can see where the pituitary gland and the hypothalamus are within the brain. They're just in this little section here. And we can see in this close-up diagram, we can see our hypothalamus up here. Okay, so the hypothalamus releases a releaser hormone, which travels all the way down into our pituitary gland here, and that stimulates the pituitary gland to then release hormones. And those hormones go to various parts of the body. There are not just puberty hormones in there, and they will go and they will obviously carry whatever message they need to that particular tissue type. Okay, but the one that we're interested in are the hormones that go to the ovaries and the testes. Okay, and those are FSH, LH, and ICSH. And you can see a nice little flow chart here that shows you the series of events that happen that trigger the release of these puberty hormones. So, firstly, the hypothalamus secretes a releaser hormone, which then stimulates the pituitary gland to release these three hormones, okay, FSH, LH, and ICSH. And once the pituitary gland is stimulated to release these three hormones, that is what triggers the onset of puberty. Okay, so if someone is just starting puberty, these are the changes that will be happening within the pituitary gland of that individual. So, how is sperm production controlled by these hormones? Okay, so we're going to look at sperm production. Now, for males, the two hormones that we are interested in are, I'll show you in the diagram here, FSH and ICSH. They are the two that are released in males from the pituitary gland that we are interested in. Now, the FSH promotes sperm production, okay? And we know that because FSH goes to the seminiferous tubules, which is the site of sperm production. ICSH, interstitial cell stimulating hormone, you can guess where that goes. It goes to the interstitial cells and it stimulates them to produce testosterone, okay? So FSH, seminiferous tubules, sperm production. ICSH goes to the interstitial cells to produce testosterone. Now, testosterone has a double job here. Okay, it has two jobs to carry out. First of all, it will stimulate sperm production. Okay, so the more testosterone you have, the more it will stimulate sperm to be produced. And it will activate the prostate gland and the seminal vesicles to produce those fluids that will help maintain the mobility and viability of the sperm. And it makes sense because until you're producing testosterone, you're not going to be producing sperm. You're not going to then need the fluids to maintain the mobility and viability. So that's why these are inactive. But when we hit puberty, suddenly the testosterone activates these glands. So the prostate gland and seminal vesicle suddenly start releasing our fluids. Now, testosterone levels can get too high in individuals. And so we have to have what's known as a feedback mechanism. Okay. It's called negative feedback because when we produce too high a level of testosterone, when we have too much testosterone, that testosterone will then go back and it will inhibit the pituitary gland and it will stop the pituitary gland from releasing FSH and ICSH. And when it inhibits the pituitary gland and these hormones are not produced, then we're going to get less testosterone and less sperm. Okay, and that makes sense. If we could, it's a bit like end product inhibition, feedback inhibition that we learned about in Unit 1. When there's too much, a critical concentration of an end product, that end product will then go back, all the way back to the start, and it will inhibit an earlier stage. And in this case, it's inhibiting the pituitary gland to secrete less FSH and less ICSH. And the net result of that is less testosterone is produced and the levels will start to come down. Okay, so we call this negative feedback. Okay, that negative feedback control of testosterone is achieved by the FSH and the ICSH. Okay, because those levels will go down. So we're moving on to the hormonal control of the menstrual cycle now. Now, the menstrual cycle takes place over approximately 28 days. Now, the reason we say approximately is menstrual cycles can vary greatly. So for some individuals, it's low 20s in terms of days, and for other individuals, it can go up into the 30s or even the 40s in terms of the number of days. Okay, so that can vary greatly. When we say approximately 20, that just means sort of a mean or an average of all individuals. And one of the reasons why 28 days is useful is because it's quite easy to split up into sections, which means learning about it and so on is a little bit easier for us too. So don't take that as if your menstrual cycle is not 28 days, then there's something wrong. This is just approximate, okay? And it can vary greatly from that. Now, when we're talking about the menstrual cycle and we want to measure it, we talk about the first day, menstruation, being regarded as day one of the cycle, okay? So as soon as menstruation starts, that's the first day of the menstrual cycle. Now, the menstrual cycle is split into two 14-day phases. The first one we're going to look at is called the follicular phase. Okay, the follicular phase. And that, as I say, takes place over the first 14 days or the first half of the menstrual cycle. Now, as you would expect from the name follicular phase, the hormone that is responsible for triggering this is FSH, okay, follicular stimulating hormone, follicle stimulating hormone. And what that does is it stimulates the development of the follicle, as the name suggests, and the production of the hormone estrogen. Now, we said in topic 2.1 that it produces or secretes hormones. This is the hormone that it secretes initially. Okay, we'll talk about another one later on, but initially it secretes estrogen during the first 14 days. Okay, so the follicle is developing, it's maturing, and it's also secreting estrogen. Now, estrogen's job is to stimulate something called the proliferation of the endometrium. And I always think that's quite a tricky phrase to get your head around. But proliferation simply means to start to get thicker, okay? To increase the number of cells. And so therefore the endometrium, which is the wall of the uterus, starts to get thicker as a result of this increase in cell number. Okay. And we can see that in this diagram here on the right. We can see the endometrium here, and we can see menstruation happening in the first 7 days or so. And then we can see this proliferation happening of the endometrium, where we can see the increase in the number of cells, and we can see the endometrium getting thicker over time there. Why is this important? Well, what we're doing is we're preparing that endometrium for implantation or potential implantation from a fertilized ovum. The estrogen also affects the consistency of the cervical mucus. So the cervix is located just above the vagina, but just below the uterus. And so the thicker the cervical mucus, the harder it is for sperm to swim into the uterus and then eventually up into the oviduct and meet the egg. So thinning the cervical mucus will make it more easily penetrated by the sperm. Okay, it means they can get to the ovum much more easily. Now, throughout these first 14 days, we can see the levels of estrogen just gradually rising and gradually rising. Now, at this point here, where the estrogen gets to its peak, okay, where it gets to its highest, at that same time, that triggers the release of this hormone up here, the luteinizing or LH hormone. You can see that there's a surge in that LH there around about the same time where we get peak estrogen levels, okay? So the peak levels of estrogen stimulate a surge in the secretion of LH, okay? Now, why is that important? Well, this surge in LH triggers one of the most important parts of the cycle, which is ovulation, okay? And if we look at this, the ovarian cycle part of the diagram here, we can see the follicle gradually developing, over the 14 days or so of the follicular phase. And then right at the end, when we get those peak levels of LH, we can see at the same time we get ovulation occurring. And remember, ovulation is simply the release of the egg or the ovum from the follicle that surrounds it. And then the ovum moves into the oviduct. Okay, so ovulation is the release of an egg or an ovum. Okay, so the release of an egg or an ovum from the follicle in the ovary. All right, and this usually happens around about the midpoint of the menstrual cycle. And again, it says it usually happens. Sometimes it's just a little bit earlier or a little bit later. Sometimes when the cycle's not 28 days, for example, it's not going to happen obviously in day 14. If the cycle is 30 days, it'll happen around about day 15. If the cycle is 40 days, it'll happen around about day 20. Okay, it's the midpoint, which is the key thing to remember for ovulation, rather than a specific day number. Because as I say, the cycle itself can change in terms of its duration. So that's the follicular phase. That's the first half of the menstrual cycle. So the second half of the menstrual cycle is called the luteal phase. And the luteal phase is where the follicle, which previously housed the ovum, then develops into a structure known as the corpus luteum. And that corpus luteum secretes the hormone progesterone. Okay, and we can see that in our diagram here. If we look here, this follicle, which previously housed the ovum, then develops and changes into a corpus luteum, which we can see in the second half of the menstrual cycle here. Okay, and that corpus luteum is important because that releases the hormone progesterone. And we can see the progesterone levels here in blue increasing during the luteal phase. Almost no progesterone during the first half of the stage, but then it gradually increases during the luteal phase, okay, until about this point here, where we get to peak estrogen levels. The role of progesterone during the luteal phase is to further develop and vascularize the endometrium, okay, or vascularization of the endometrium. And what that basically means is that it helps to give it blood vessels, okay? It helps it to get a better blood supply. And that's important because it helps the endometrium to prepare for implantation if fertilization occurs. Because if that embryo or ball of cells is going to implant into the wall of the uterus, the endometrium, then it's going to need a good blood supply in order to be able to provide it with all of the nutrients and so on that it needs to develop. Okay, so luteal phase, the follicle develops into a corpus luteum, which secretes progesterone, and the role of progesterone is to promote further development. We can see that further development and thickening of the endometrium there, and also the vascularization of the endometrium. Essentially, it increases its blood supply, okay? It provides it with more blood vessels and so on. And why is this important? In case of implantation, if the ovum does become fertilized. If we want to implant that fertilized ovum, which will then have divided a number of times, we want to implant that into the wall of the endometrium. Now, during the luteal phase, there's a negative feedback of the ovarian hormones. Okay, we talked about negative feedback earlier in terms of testosterone. What negative feedback is, it's essentially a loop where when there's a high concentration of one thing, it will inhibit the production of another thing. Okay, in this case, it's the high concentration of the ovarian hormones, which then inhibits the pituitary gland and therefore the secretion of FSH and LH. Okay, and that's what stops us from producing any more follicles. Okay, preventing further follicles from developing during the luteal phase. We want to wait until we reset the cycle and start the follicular phase again. So the negative feedback of those ovarian hormones, that's the estrogen and the progesterone, on the pituitary gland stops or lowers the secretion of FSH and LH, which prevents further follicles from developing. I would say that point is the one that is most commonly forgotten about by students in the exam. So your mission is to buck that trend and to make sure you do learn that and you know it well for your exam. It might well come up. Now, when we go further along the luteal phase, what we notice is we see the LH starting to drop, okay? We see the progesterone reaching a peak and then starting to drop. Now, that lack of LH leads to the degeneration of the corpus luteum, okay? So we can see the corpus luteum, nice here, the early part of the corpus luteum, nice and big, producing lots of testosterone. Then we can see it starting to decay a little bit, and that's in line with the lack of LH, okay? So the corpus luteum starts to degenerate, okay? And when it degenerates, what's going to happen to the progesterone levels? That's also going to fall, okay? So we're going to see a subsequent drop in progesterone levels, and that's because the corpus luteum is degenerating, and that is what's producing the testosterone. And that is what's producing the progesterone, which is why it's going to start to fall. Eventually, all of this is going to lead to menstruation, okay? And we can see that there. We can see the endometrium starting to shed there, okay? And you can see it getting less and less thick there. And we can see the progesterone levels dipping back down to what they were at the start of the follicular phase. Now, if fertilization does occur, then the corpus luteum does not degenerate, okay? It does not degenerate. And if the corpus luteum remains, then the progesterone levels are also going to remain high. Okay, if we stop this from degenerating, progesterone levels will remain high like this. And if the progesterone levels remain high, endometrium will remain high. Okay, it will remain nice and thick. It will not degenerate and menstruation will not occur. And then the next cycle will not occur. And that's why when a woman becomes pregnant, she does not enter the next menstrual cycle. Okay, and won't do until after birth. So a little summary of the main points involved in the menstrual cycle. So during the follicular phase, that's usually day 1 to 14 if it's a 28-day cycle. FSH is released and that causes the development of the follicle. FSH, development of follicle. The follicle then produces estrogen, which causes the proliferation of the endometrium. And when we get to peak estrogen levels, that causes a surge in LH, which triggers ovulation around about the midpoint of the follicular phase of the menstrual cycle. So that is, although I've said day 14 here, that could be any day depending on the total length of the menstrual cycle will be the midpoint. So as I said earlier on, if it's a 36-day cycle, that's going to be day 18. Okay, if it's a 32-day cycle, it's going to be day 16. If it's a 28-day cycle, which is the approximate length, then it'll be day 14. After day 14, after ovulation, we get the luteal phase, where the corpus luteum starts to produce progesterone, which causes the vascularization of the endometrium, which means it's ready to receive the blastocyst. That's that ball of cells that forms after fertilization of an ovum. We get the negative feedback of the pituitary gland due to the high levels of estrogen and progesterone. That stops LH and FSH from being produced and stops further follicles from maturing. When the LH levels start to get lower, we see the degeneration of the corpus luteum, which also causes a dip in the levels of progesterone, which results in menstruation. Okay, so that's the key points there that are involved in this menstrual cycle. Okay, so welcome back to the past paper section of this lesson. We're going to look at some past paper questions in this topic to help us apply that knowledge. As always, you can pause the video if you want to answer it on your own before I go over the answers. So changes in the ovary during the menstrual cycle are described below. So the corpus luteum forms, the ovulation occurs, progesterone is produced, corpus luteum degenerates, and the follicle develops. The sequence in which these changes occur following menstruation is, so remember, menstruation is day 1 of the cycle. So essentially, put these in order from day 1 of the cycle. So the first thing that's going to happen, if we look at all of our options here, is surely going to be that the follicle develops, okay? So we're going to have stage 5 first of all. So that means it can be C and it can be D, but it can't be A or B. Okay, now if we look at the tubing first there for A or B, that's ovulation occurs, and we know that doesn't happen right at the start. That happens at the midpoint, doesn't it? Now, next, we've got the corpus luteum degenerates. We know that happens near the end. Progesterone is produced. We know that happens just after the midpoint. Ovulation occurs. We know that happens at the midpoint. And the corpus luteum forms. We know that happens after the midpoint. So next up is going to be number 2, ovulation occurs. Okay, and we know, just based on that our answer is going to be C, isn't it? Just based on working out those first two, okay? Because that's saying that progesterone is produced before ovulation occurs. And we know that progesterone can't be produced before that because we need the corpus luteum to form first. So we know the answer can't be D, okay? We'll put the rest in order just because of that. So as I said, the corpus luteum needs to form first before progesterone is produced. And then obviously the corpus luteum will degenerate as a last step out of these 5 that we've got there, okay? So our answer is going to be C for that one. You need to know those steps and you need to know the order of them well for your exam. Okay, question 10. The diagram below represents connections between parts of the male reproductive system. Which arrow in the diagram does not represent a male reproductive hormone? Okay, so let's have a look at all of these hormones. So does the pituitary gland send a hormone to the prostate gland? Well, I'm not sure. I'm not sure about that. So I think we can put a question mark next to that. I'm not sure about any hormone that goes from the pituitary to the prostate gland. Does it send a hormone to the testes? Absolutely it does. FSH and ICSH. Does a hormone go from the testes back to the pituitary gland? Well, that's actually our testosterone, okay? That is our testosterone that does that, okay? This is our ICSH and our FSH here, okay? They both go to the testes from the pituitary gland. And is there a hormone that goes from the testes to the prostate gland? Well, there is. Testosterone activates the prostate gland. So again, that goes that way. So ultimately, which arrow does not represent a male reproductive hormone? It's going to be A. Okay. There is no hormone that goes from the pituitary gland directly to the prostate gland. Okay, number 11 here. The graph below shows the chance of a woman becoming pregnant following sexual intercourse on the day before and after ovulation. Right, perfect. Okay, so basically what it's saying in this graph is the greatest chance of becoming pregnant here happens here. This is where the graph is highest. And if we go all the way down, that's -2. Okay, so 2 days before ovulation. Okay, that gives the greatest chance of becoming pregnant. So this woman has a 28-day menstrual cycle and ovulates on the 3rd of May. I'm going to underline those bits of information. On which day in May would having sexual intercourse give her the best chance of becoming pregnant? Okay, so this question always bamboozles students a little bit because the obvious answer here, well, it's 2 days before ovulation gives you the best chance. So you'd think the answer here would be the 1st of May. But that's not one of your options there. So what a lot of students do is they get very confused at this stage. But what we need to remember is it's a 28-day cycle. So that means that 28 days later, the same thing is going to happen again. Now, if we know that ovulation happens on the 3rd of May here, if we go to 28 days later, ovulation will also be happening then. So if we add the 3rd to the 28th, we get the 31st of May, okay, 28 plus 3, the 31st of May. And then we know the best time is 2 days before ovulation. So 2 days before the 1st of May is going to be the 29th of May. So our answer there is going to be C. That's a tricky question, and students do always find that hard when they do it. Let's have a look at this question here. The graph below shows the concentration of 2 ovarian hormones in a woman's blood during her menstrual cycle. Okay, so we have to name hormone X. So if we have a look at hormone X remains pretty low throughout the first half of the cycle, and it's only around about the halfway point that it starts to increase. And then for the last part of the cycle, it decreases again. Now, we know this is estrogen because it's labeled, okay, and we can see that peak in estrogen just before the halfway point. So this other hormone here has to be progesterone, okay? Okay, question B. So what effect does estrogen have on the following structures? So the uterus between days 4 and 12 in the cycle. So what effect does the estrogen have on that? Okay, the uterus, of course, is the wall of the uterus is called the endometrium. So it's looking for information about that. So it causes proliferation of the endometrium. Okay, it also causes changes in the cervical mucus, the consistency of that cervical mucus, but that's in the cervix, not the uterus. So we are only going to be concerned with that answer there. Okay, so what effect does estrogen have on the pituitary gland on day 12 of the cycle? So day 12 of the cycle, around about halfway, the estrogen levels are very high. What's it going to be doing to the pituitary gland? It's going to be inhibiting the pituitary gland and reducing the release of FSH and LH. And we could just say, just for a bit of flourish, due to negative feedback, because we know that, so we may as well just say it in the question. Okay, describe one way in which the graph would be different if the woman became pregnant during this cycle. Okay, so how would this graph be different if she became pregnant? Well, if she becomes pregnant, the corpus luteum will not degenerate, which means that they'll continue to produce progesterone. And if you continue to produce the progesterone, those levels would remain high. So progesterone levels would remain high, or you could say they would not decrease. The progesterone levels would not decrease in the way that they normally do. Okay, so the diagram shows sections through 2 structures found in the ovary at different times in the menstrual cycle. Name structures P and Q. Okay, so structure P. P is going to be, you can see the ovum still in there, so it's going to be called the follicle at this stage. Okay, while the ovum is still in there, it's still the follicle and it's just maturing during this time. Q, however, we can see no ovum there, and we can see from its shape and so on that this is developed into our corpus luteum. Okay, luteum. All right. And what key event in the menstrual cycle occurs before P develops into Q? So in order for P to develop into Q, we need to see the release of the ovum. Okay, this ovum needs to be released. And the release of the ovum is called ovulation. Okay, so that's the key event that needs to occur before P develops into Q. Diagram below shows the fertilization of an ovum and its subsequent early development. So we have to name structures A and B from this diagram. So let's look at structure A. Structure A is where the ovum enters after it's released from the ovary. That is called the oviduct. And B over here, that's the wall of the uterus. That's going to be the endometrium. That's going to be our answers there. The ovum is released from the follicle in the ovary and then becomes the corpus luteum. These structures are affected by the pituitary hormones. And complete the table below to show the effect of these hormones on these structures. Okay, so what is the effect of FSH on the follicle? So it stimulates the follicle to mature or develop and release. What does it release? Okay, and the second one, what is the effect of LH on the corpus luteum? So the drop in LH causes the degeneration of the corpus luteum. Degeneration. There we go. Mr. White struggling with his spelling there. All right. Okay, in part C, explain what prevents the further development of follicles when an embryo is developing in the uterus. So if an embryo is developing in the uterus, what will prevent more follicles from being produced? Well, if there's an embryo in the uterus, our corpus luteum will not degenerate and it will continue to produce progesterone. Okay, so progesterone levels will remain high or not decrease, which means the endometrium will remain proliferated and vascularized. Okay, so those things that happened, the thickening of the endometrium, that happened earlier on, that will remain. And the ovarian hormones will have a negative feedback on the pituitary gland and inhibit the release of FSH and LH, and therefore no new follicles will be stimulated to mature. Okay, so something along those lines would get you the 2 marks for that question there. Okay, folks, so I hope that's been useful. This lesson, we've done quite a few of the past paper questions and put a bit of that knowledge into practice as well. It's always a topic that does come up in the exam, so it's well worth making sure that you know this one really well. That's a good hint for you. Okay, folks, that's all for this lesson. I'll see you in the next one. Bye for now. Class dismissed.